thank you everyone for coming out to Gun Violence. What can we do now? Number one, I'd like to first, before I even introduce myself, thank Elise Anand from BRICS, Brooklyn Free Speech, and Audrey Duncan from BronxNet for, producing this panel and, being so intentional about talking about this topic. So I'm Ro Johnson. I am here at BRIC with BRIC TV's, I'm the Director of Public Affairs and Social Justice Programming for BRIC TV. And I would like to introduce our esteemed panel. So we have to the left of me, we have Alan Arthur, who is the Engagement Manager for Solutions Journalism Network. They re-examine journalism coverage by emphasizing solutions to solving shared problems rather than focusing on what went wrong. So then we have, we have Walter Garriacoa. And Walter is the Director of Creative Services for BronxNet. So BronxNet trains Bronx residents in television production, and they feature shows created by community producers, similar to what we do here at BRIC and in our Brooklyn Free Speech area. Then we have Ramik Jamar Williams, who is the co-executive director of Kings Against Violence Initiative, CAVI, and CAVI works to prevent and eliminate interpersonal violence between young people through advocacy, peer leadership, community mobilization, and social justice. And finally, we have Shanita Hill. She's the co-executive director of Bronx Connect, which is a faith-based, community-based organization that offers alternatives to detention, incarceration, and does violence prevention work. So, yes, switch slides. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm supposed to be doing slides. Bear with me. That's me. This is Arthur. Ramik, we're skipping around, okay? Shanita's on the end. And, okay, hold on a second. And then there's Walter. So you have their titles. I am sorry that I did not do the slides. And we're going to play a video. Okay, we have a few videos that we're going to play, and then we're going to kind of get in conversation about those videos. Now, these videos are from a series that we at BRIC TV did about gun violence. There are 4 videos in the entirety of the series. One of those videos features Kavi and a young man named Divine who had suffered a gunshot situation, and he talks about his recovery. He talks about the experience of the shooting and his recovery. And then we talked to many violence interrupters and hospital workers about the overall arc of a shooting. So the first one I'm going to play is just giving a few stats. And then we're going to talk about the stats kind of associated with gun violence in, here in New York City, but, it's applicable around the country.
Gun sales are up. There's more guns on the street. During parts of the pandemic, people are losing their jobs, and there was a little more desperation as well.
Everybody being locked in, they not being able to do the things that they normally do. And then there's no resources. There's no basketball courts. Community centers is gone. We had to have something to give them so they won't be out there going crazy.
So I want to start this conversation off with the people who are boots on the ground and with people who are affected by gun violence and are the violence interrupters in the community, and kind of can talk about, the beginning, middle, and end of this process. So I'm going to turn it over to Ramik first to kind of talk about those statistics, and then kind of the precursors that get us to that point, if you will.
Is this on? Can you hear me? Excellent. So CAVI, Kings Against Violence Initiative, is a youth development organization that operates cure violence programs within the crisis management system here in New York City. What does that mean? That means we operate a hospital violence intervention program within Kings County Medical Center. We work with local schools, including Eagle Academy, High School for Public Service, Wingate High School campus, and other local schools to do healing circles, restorative justice, leadership programs. It also means we work within community settings. That means we work with tenants associations, block associations, elected officials for their public-facing events. That could be block parties, back to school fairs, any of those things that you see in open streets and open spaces. We do this work and it's supported by the work we do for advocacy and research. So all of our programs are quantified through a research lens. We work with the Urban Institute. We also work with Karna on capturing our efforts to outcomes. Our advocacy work includes promoting the Clean Slate Act, fair access to victims' compensation, solutions, not suspensions, and the Youth Justice and Opportunities Act. We do that because that's what changes things, right? That's what moves the needle for young people, and particularly young people of color who are often most affected by gun violence. So the thing to know about gun violence and violence in general is that 85% of the people who are perpetrators of gun violence were actually victims of some form of violence before they became perpetrators. So you can see there's like this cycle that can kind of happen in that way. The other part to violence and gun violence in particular is that we see it through a dual lens. Yes, there are homicides, but there are also suicides. So of the people who are impacted by gun violence as suicide, over 80% of them are successful, meaning suicide by gun is the highest rate of self-inflicted injury. What does that mean exactly? That means we have a gun challenge in this country. Recognizing that America is built and has this desire to have access to guns, and rightfully so in some cases where you need to protect yourselves, or let's say you find hunting to be a sport, CAVI doesn't take a position on access to guns. But we do take a position on gun safety, advocating for guns to be safely stored, for them to be kept away from children, for them to be kept away from people who would harm others and have been identified as doing so. The other part is that we identify the need to promote mental health and wellness, right? Recognizing that there is a slight correlation in some cases between gun violence and mental health. Usually that's impacted by suicide. People are not well, and so therefore they implode and attempt or commit suicide. The data that I think we refer to in terms of violence really outlines a lot of what's been talked about in the past several years and what's driven several social movements, including Occupy Wall Street, Black Lives Matter, even going as far back as civil rights, in that typically communities of color are higher impacted by violence. So in gun violence in particular. So if we recognize there's a social dynamic to gun violence, and we recognize that there's a higher access to gun violence, especially here in New York State, as per last year's Supreme Court decision to eliminate restrictions on gun ownership, we can see that there are conflated issues that are negatively impacting communities of color. So that's why CAVI exists. CAVI exists to empower young people, to help families and neighborhoods and communities heal, to actually elevate the challenges and the realities that our communities face to stakeholders, elected officials, city council members, state assembly, state senate, and on a federal level as well. And so that's who CAVI is. We are one of many organizations. I would say our uniqueness is that we do see our work on a trifocal lens of direct service, advocacy, and research.
So thank you so much for that, Ramik. And so in that vein, I want to speak with Shanita about Bronx Connect. And you can talk on that, Mike, and kind of the work that you guys are doing in the community, just to set the stage, because we're here to talk about how, community media can mitigate the effects of gun violence. But I think we first need to have a foundation on the work that's being done already to mitigate it.
Hello? Hello? Yes. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Shanita Hill. I am the Mental Health Therapeutic Supervisor with Bronx Connect RTG. And Bronx Connect is a social justice agency. We work with young people who are system involved, who are unfortunately dealing with the legal system. We support them by providing various ATI, alternative to incarceration, alternative to detention programming, and also some prevention programming. In addition to the programming that we offer young people, we also have a cure violence program funded by also CMS, the mayor's office, and now DYCD called RTG, Release the Grip. And that is where I am the mental health supervisor with that program. And we're all things youth. We're all things youth. Our motto is keeping youth out of prisons for life, because we acknowledge that there's a major shift that happens to a young person when they're incarcerated, when they're removed from the community, when they're taken from the home. And oftentimes this is trauma. I'm sorry. Often this is trauma. So we're looking at what does this young person need to keep them whole and safe while they're in the community. And if we put programming in place, whether it be prevention programming or mandated programming by the courts, can we help make this young person whole again? Can we help speak to some of the issues that this young person may be facing? So that's what we do at Bronx Connect RTG.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Shanita. As we see, I have some challenges with the slides, but I'm not going to. It wouldn't be me if there wasn't this drama. But I'm not going to go into another video right now, because the next thing that I want to go into is I want to ask Walter, like, what do you see as far as storytelling surrounding from community producers surrounding gun violence, and how have you seen it help community producers tell their stories, move policy, what have you, and just get a greater involvement in improving this in the community?
Thank you. Greetings, everybody. My name is Walter Garaycoa, and I'm fortunate to be the creative director for Bronx Net Television in the Bronx. I know we're in Brooklyn, but I'm super glad to see someone from the neighborhood. We are very fortunate to have a wonderful outlet. We are not interrupters. We're not experts in how to go after the different services or to be there on the ground to help the victims and to prevent gun violence. What we do is we were able to figure out a way to use our tools, the storytelling tools that can impact, at least in my view, I think of it as a triangle, right? And in my mind, I hope that we can definitely have a stronger impact beyond just the Bronx community, New York City community, and eventually change the United States as a whole. What is that triangle? We want to be able to have an impact with the person that it's holding a gun and it's ready to pull that trigger. That's our main focal point. We want to tell stories so that person, whoever that person is, doesn't do it. Our second point in our triangle is our community. Who can better help our own children and our own families than us in a neighborhood? Remember your bodega, remember your supermarket. That's who we want to target because they know where the problems are. And how do we empower them? How do we bring the programs to that corner, to that building? And the third point in our triangle, at least in my storytelling, is to change policy. Because the kids are getting guns, families are being broken, our community are being ravaged by this epidemic. So how do we change our laws right? Whatever law, in whichever side you are. So then all that violence and stuff. It's an epidemic. We just went through a terrible one, right? So now telling us stories, how do we prevent the COVID? We started hiding, right? Until there was a vaccine. I'm trying to tell our stories. So we bring that vaccine to the public. We bring that conversation up there, front and center. So all of us tonight can talk to our families, can talk to our children, and do something about it, right? Because if we don't do it in our community, nobody else is going to help us. Bronx is super happy to create programs that cover our main show, Our Home, Our Heaven, Safe Streets, where we bring violence interrupters, victims of gun violence, and elected officials. There's our triangle. We want to have that conversation every time we talk about it. And we also go beyond that. We want to cover the news that happen, not in what unfortunately happens with our competitors, right? Because if it bleeds, it leads, right? I want to change that. We want to change that at Bronx Television. We don't want to lead that way. We want to lead with a change that really makes a difference, right? And having that conversation and bringing you folks here, it's an amazing thing, right? Because we can change it. I'm sure of it. We just got to keep moving forward with all the programs, the conversations, and policy.
Thank you for that, Walter. And so that brings me to Alan, because you have the tools, like the journalistic tools, to go and tell these stories in a way that can move policy. And so how would you advise either people instructing community producers or community producers themselves in the way that, kind of identifies those solutions and weaves them into a storytelling narrative that is compelling enough to move policy, just like Walter said?
Well, first of all, thank you all for having me here. I appreciate it. So solutions journalism is kind of bubbling up a lot, and people have sometimes there's misconceptions about what it is, but basically it means reporting as rigorously on what's working to address problems as we do on the problems themselves. And so the stories kind of have four, we call them pillars to it. So the stories are built around how this response is happening, the evidence that it's having some impact, that there's some kind of replicable insight to it that others could learn from. Like, let's say another community wanted to emulate Kavi and learn from them. Well, what have they figured out that might help them do this work? But also that there's limitations to this response or caveats to it. There's no single response to gun violence. There's no single response to climate change. So we include, like, why isn't this more effective? Is it expensive? It doesn't scale. There's particular laws or policies that make it easier or harder to do this particular thing, whatever it might be. And what we find is that these stories go sort of deeper than the kind of, it sometimes gets associated with like a feel-good story or a happy ending. These are not typically feel-good stories. I mean, they can have happy elements to them, but they tend to dig in kind of deeply and really explore these responses to these problems in a deep way. And so it's not sort of fluffy good news. And I think sometimes even new journalists, producers, creators are stuck in that kind of binary of like, this is good news or it's bad news. This is about death and despair, or this is about a happy ending. And we need to know about the problems, but the happy ending kind of framing is like, it's a little bit like cotton candy. Like it feels good for a second and then it's kind of gone. So solutions journalism and that approach, or even just having that mindset of like, let me go look for who's working on this and try to tell their story in a rigorous way, is a kind of deeper way of telling these stories that helps people come away with a sense of agency, not just feeling good about it, but a sense of, wait, I could do this. I could be involved in this. These are people just like me, and it's not all perfect. And my colleague, Liza, has a saying where she says, we don't go to James Bond movies thinking James Bond is going to die at the end. We know he's probably going to live, right? But the story is still compelling. And so I think this perspective actually provides a really compelling framework for telling these stories where you're able to take people inside what it's like. I mean, there is no world in which how to be a violence interrupter is not an interesting story for people. The problem is we don't tell it. We talk about an organization that's nice or a nice person who founded something, but we really don't help people understand, like, how does this work? Couldn't you have this in your community? So I think bringing this structure to things, either as the producers or introducing them to this idea. I will say, as a freelancer, I also work with formerly incarcerated people mainly. And when I explain, like, here's how I work, here's how I kind of tell this story, they're like, really? That exists? Like, people are always trying to put their finger on it and they don't know that there's a name for it. So when I say, like, I'm not here to tell a happy story, people actually don't want like cheerleaders. They want somebody who understands them. And when you frame it like this, people really feel understood. So I think introducing this is a fantastic way to tell compelling stories and help expand people's ideas of what is possible so that they don't feel so helpless all the time when it comes to dealing with these issues.
Thank you so much for that, Alan. So on that note, we actually have another video, and you guys gotta forgive me for like my complete failure with these slides. However, okay, I'm going to play a slide. This is a 4-minute clip, but it takes you on the journey of post-shooting and the recovery period and violence interruption and how it is also helping the recovery process. So I just encourage everyone to just take a look at this clip and as an example of, it's from that same series, that gun violence series that Brick TV did last spring, it's an example of a way that journalism can weave in the human narrative of like somebody's experience and tell kind of a solutions-oriented approach. So I'm going to play this, and then I want to toss it to Shanita and Ramik to kind of tell us why this is so important. So hold on one second.
For some reason, the ambulance got there like immediately. I remember telling them to take my sneakers off so they wouldn't get too much blood on them. I had a good pair of jeans on. I knew they were gonna cut those. I believe once they started cutting the jeans, I just blacked out after that. By the time I made it to the hospital, it was actually Christmas. It was after 12. There were no surgeons available that day, I believe. So I had surgery on the 26th. Early in the morning, first thing in the morning, Kings County got me into surgery. But before the surgery, they drilled 2 holes in my knee, and they put a rod in there, and then they put a weight system on the end of the rod to pull the bones down to keep it in place, which was excruciating pain. There was one bullet that went in about right here and came out on my upper thigh. But in this passage, it destroyed everything there. But when they explained to me the damage and I seen the x-ray, I was shocked. I was in awe, because to know that that's your bone that was once like this and now is like that, it's something that is unfathomable. Like, you can't even describe it, really.
Yeah, I can definitely reach out to them and give them a call. Okay.
So funny because when I actually went to go visit Derek was kind of skeptical on, speaking because, we coming in, we're like, who is these people?
My sister Taisha, my first memory of her, she comes in with her suit, her uniform. I don't know if it was the morphine or what. I thought she was the cops. And I was just like, listen, I spoke to y'all already.
I went back to visit Derek again the next day, and I tried to be consistent during the time that he was here, so he know that I'm for real, and it ain't a game. And then Derek started opening up. Then Derek started telling me his needs and his wants.
One thing I can say is the emotional support. They talk to you and check on you constantly to the point that sometimes you're like, all right, I'll talk to you later. But they definitely check on you. They definitely make sure that you're mentally stable. They ask you all the time about your physical therapy, if you need anything. Due to COVID, I couldn't have any guests. I couldn't have any visitors. I couldn't see my kids. I couldn't see anyone from my family. FaceTime was it. FaceTime was everything. But, there's only so much you could do on FaceTime.
So Derek was here on Christmas Eve and actually spent New Year's here as well. So he was really upset with that as well during the time because nobody wants to be here. It's Christmas time, the holidays, you want to be home with the kids. I had to make it my effort to, make sure that Derek stood and lift his spirits, and his spirit was always uplifted and he wouldn't turn into a Grinch. I treat this as if I'm treating my family. Even when I'm doing an intervention and an assessment with the patient, I'm not looking at them like, oh, they're just a patient that comes in. Like, they are my family as well. I feel like I have adopted another brother or sister or uncle or auntie. The first thing Derek said was he able to go to a rehabilitation center? We assisted Derek going to the rehabilitation center, and then he was communicating with us that he was gonna be homeless, he ain't gonna have nowhere to go, and if there's anything that we can do. We made that connection, got Derek in a hotel right now.
What they did was spectacular, actually. It was really fast. Once I was told that I could put weight back on my leg, they got me out of there within 72 hours to a really good spot. And I really appreciate them for that.
So I just want to shout out my colleague, Jonathan Leaf, who is the executive producer of our Be Heard documentaries. And he produced that overall piece, which you can go find the longer piece. But that, like we said, that's like talking about the human story and then presenting a solution that's out there in the world that a lot of people aren't talking about, especially in mainstream media. And so I just wanted to kind of direct it to you, Ramik, and just ask, why is it so important to talk? You guys are doing the work already. It's happening, What is the value of the storytelling of the work that you're doing?
I think the value is what was mentioned earlier, is the agency that it gives people, but also the fact that violence is a larger issue than what you just see on the 7 o'clock news. And that if 85% of the perpetrators of violence were formerly victims of violence, there shows that there's an issue there. And so if we give individuals the opportunity to heal from their own traumatic events, we may be able to see a decrease in crime and in violence. The challenge or the opportunity that you get when you allow someone to tell their story is that you get a glimpse into how they got to that space. So at CAVI, we utilize trauma-informed care. Trauma-informed care is an approach to healing that helps people identify how they got there, how they got in the hospital, how they got on the hospital bed, how they became victims of violence, as opposed to saying what happened to you, which is much more deflating and detached of an approach to healing. And so one of the things to that point that we're doing this summer is that we're giving 19 young people cameras and working with Brick on this so that they could capture public safety through their lens. And so we can imagine what they'll see, and we'll edit it and format it and create a montage, and there'll be some type of public display. But the thinking behind that is to allow young people to tell their story, right? What it is that they're facing, especially over the summertime, right? When there's not that regimen of going to school, if they are going to school, or having the expectation of going to school. So when we allow people to tell their story, I would assume, or I believe, that we also get a glimpse into what are the solutions or the possible solutions around violence. What are they facing? Hunger, poverty, disconnectedness in terms of isolation, neglect, malnutrition, maltreatment. All of those things that we hear about separately in reports and things, and read about in reports, newspapers, or hear about tangentially. But when we put it all together, we can see how those things, those ills, social ills, really create a larger problem.
It's funny you say that because doing social justice storytelling and programming, you find that all of the issues are interconnected. And so I kind of wanted to ask you, Shanita, especially being a faith-based institution, kind of when you find those, and that being sometimes the first point of contact for some of the resources that people need, or social justice help that people are seeking, are you finding something similar? Like, if we can solve some of these other issues, that Ramik just listed, maybe gun violence isn't as big an issue.
I would say yes. Really getting to the core of the person. One of the questions that was stated is, why is it important to tell these stories? Because these are people, in this story, there's this gentleman, he survived, thank a higher power, he survived. But often in my work, they don't survive. And, for my team and I, working with a mother after she's lost her child, what do you say to a mother who's lost their child? And as much as I do the work, as often as my team and I show up in these places, there's never the words. Because that is the human experience. Because as a professional, we know there's a way in which we do things, but on that human existence, what do you say to a mother whose child is never coming back? What do you say to that, maybe the victim's child that doesn't understand that dad is never coming back? Or they're saying, where's dad? And you're sitting in someone's living room in someone's home, and now you're helping them plan a funeral for a child that was 15 years old. So telling these stories, because these are people's lives. These young people matter. They matter to someone. There's a family that's never going to be okay. There's a mom that's just never going to be the same again. There's a dad, a sister, a brother, a friend that's just never going to look at life the same. And that's why telling these stories matter. So maybe if we are investing in some of the things that happen before the actual violent act, maybe that can spare the next family. Because I tell you, I can't say it enough, I have a team member in the room, but the work that we do, because what do you say? And with all the words in the dictionary, there's just never the right word to say to someone. It's hard to look at a parent. And that's when unfortunately, that's the first time we ever talk.
That's very powerful. And go on.
I just wanted to add that Derek, he was shot coming out of the bodega in his neighborhood. He wasn't engaged in any criminal activity, wasn't gang affiliated and gang active, or he was literally coming out of his bodega and was an innocent victim, a bystander. And so I think that begins to that type of nuance in storytelling is important, because it chips away at this narrative that, well, all victims, especially young Black and brown victims of gunshots, are gang affiliated. They're criminals. They deserve it, whatever the case may be. He's a dad. He's a son. He's a brother. He's a human. And so I think when we tell the story, it's important to tell the full story.
Yes.
Agreed. And I would also say that even the ones that, are gang affiliated, there's a story behind that too. And that just brings me to kind of storytelling as healing and therapy and mental health. And so I wanted to ask you, Walter, when the community comes in, do you have examples of people who are, working through their trauma, whether it's loss or their own experience, as a victim of gun violence, or a mother that's lost her child, or mother or father that's lost their child, using storytelling as a healing tool, and how how that helped, and kind of how we can present that as an option for healing.
Thank you, Ro. So how do we quantify healing, right? Can we say, I was sad and I'm happy, right? Oh, it's 99% happy, or is it 50% happy? So I feel that just the engagement brings such a strong value to be able to bring the victims, right? It's so sad for me to hear the stories that happen on your experience, and the stories that we hear. But bringing the mothers of the victims, we have in our first show for Our Home and Heaven Safe Streets, we have a grandmother who lost a son and her grandson. It's in pretty bad shape. They weren't nowhere near gangs. They weren't nowhere near guns. One was waiting for a friend in a car. The other one was in a basketball court, hanging out. And we have another mother that Bronx did cover this young man's funeral. Promising person who happened to be at the wrong part of where that gun was. That video is one of our most viewed video. When we say Bronx Day, we do a lot of other stuff. We put a lot of other shows, a lot more fun. But the funeral video, and you can go check our views in Bronx Day, it's so disheartening. But when you listen to that in a different light, the healing of it, because we want to know that there is people behind the families. And the grandma and the mother told the story of, you'll see a little bit in the video. They when you watch something in the news, it's someone else's child. But for them, they're not there. And they'll never be back. How do you heal that, right? How do you comfort them? Well, we believe at Bronx that we bring the story back in again because people need to hear that this is happening, not just to gang members, not to just criminals. It's to us. The fact that that person died in our neighborhood, in that corner, it affects us, all of us. And we have to continue talking because it has to change. And that's, at least in my view, the healing comes from within out. And then eventually the community will understand that policy needs to change. More programs need to be funded. And not just at the violence interruption level, right? Let's go down to schools. Let's talk to our young minds. We can talk a toddler about guns. We can tell a toddler that de-escalating is good. You don't have to win that argument all the time. Let's share. Let's love each other no matter what. And that will translate. I really think will translate. It'll help us calm down. That's healing to me.
And that's coming back to like all those other issues that are, seeping in. Like we need more education funding. We need more, kind of community-based schools, like, that fill those gaps in from home to school and whatnot. So when we're talking about this human, like, to me, it's like storytelling that from a humanity perspective, right? And so, Alan, I just want to ask you kind of, how do we get to a point where the if it bleeds, it leads local news, right, can recognize the humanity of the communities that are typically defunded at the institutional level in many different aspects. And, this is like we're seeing the, what is the cause and effect? We're seeing the effect rather than the cause. And how do we get to a point where that humanity is recognized and you get more nuance, more than what you can usually squeeze into like a 3-minute video package?
Boy, how do we get nuance into the news? We can solve that today. I think, here's what I'll say. I think most journalists do recognize people's humanity. There's 2 problems that I constantly complain about. And I'll try to keep it brief so that we're not here until tomorrow. The first is every incentive in journalism is to report on the most miserable, depressing, awful thing you could possibly find. Read the Pulitzer Prize nominees every year. It's a list of the worst things that happened on Earth every year. So whether your newsroom says it or not, the tacit incentive of every journalist, the awards, the promotions, everything is the bleeding. So that's number one. And it's the second is, this is my little pet project of making every journalist understand this. Nice, liberal, well-meaning journalists tell these sob stories about communities. They go in, they find, he was a crack baby, and then they find like every miserable stereotype you can possibly find, and then they portray people through those lenses because they really think deep in their hearts, because they don't know any better, that this is what's going to make people care about them. That if we show all the awful things that they went through, people who have not lived this life will care about them. And they are wrong. What actually happens is you create pity. And pity does not actually inspire anyone to be on your side. What it actually has created is the view that certain communities are a net burden that need to be saved by other communities. So they do not see communities with agency solving their own problems, with great ideas but no resources to execute those ideas. They see helpless victims stuck in cycles of violence, and people read those stories and feel like they are being asked to come solve that. It is the worst possible framing you can give if you want to help. So we need to, as journalists, stop defining people by all the awful things that have happened to them and look for the literal dozens of ways there are to do interviews differently. There's a system created by a journalist named Amanda Ripley called Complicating the Narratives that's built on conflict mediation. It's wonderful. I contributed my little bit and you can go in the app for the conference. For this session, I wrote a guide for journalists about how to have healthier interviews based on restorative justice principles. There's restorative narrative. There's collaborative storytelling. There's 5 million ways to get good stories that emphasize people's humanities that don't involve what was that like? What's being shot feel like? How does that feel in your community? Can you talk about what it's like to be in prison. Prison must be awful, huh? It's like you could not design a worse way to interview, but that's how most journalists don't get interview training. That's wild. Imagine going to a psychiatrist and they're like, oh, I'm just really curious about people. You'd be like, shouldn't you have a degree or something? We get degrees with no interview training. And then we're being asked to go in and essentially defuse a bomb with no training. So we have to explore all the other ways we can talk to people and all the other ways that we can tell stories that are not just sad person lives sad life and bad things happen. Won't you please care for them? I think we do recognize humanity, but we think that's the way to do it. And we're just really, really wrong. And it's terrible.
So yeah, I thank you so much for that, Alan. And it's funny because I think it's a bit of like you recognize there's the recognition of humanity, but there's not an equal recognition of humanity and an understanding that this person that you're observing has the same potential for agency and self-determination that you do on your own. So Walter, we have another video and it's from our friends at BronxNet. And let's see if I can get this video up. And so before I start it, I just wanted, Walter, if you can set this video up and then we can talk about it afterward. And then we're kind of running short on time. So we're gonna, like after we watch this video, we'll talk about it and then maybe kind of go into some final thoughts on this topic, if that works for everybody.
Thank you. So I just took a few snippets of really thought-provoking ideas coming from the real people, the protagonists. It's not my story, it's not Bronx's stories, this is our community stories. So I wanted to kind of put together one of our main shows there. And then at the end, I wanted to showcase that there is a lighter side for healing, that we can still talk about gun violence and the prevention of gun violence in a lighter thing. And that will be the little last snippet on the video.
Okay.
Hello, and thank you for joining us for our home, our haven, Safe Streets.
Starting with Anthony. Anthony was one of my older grandsons, basically the same age as my youngest daughter.
It's not a movie, it's real life. It's not gonna end with an happy ending, or it's not a script. It's life. It's what we go through every day. Wake up 2 a.m. in the morning forgetting that he's dead.
You should not be 18 years old on your birthday buying an AR-15.
There's a lot of attention to the mass shootings, and rightfully so. People are losing their lives every day here too. And it may not be a whole lot of people at one time, but we have 2 and 3 murders per day.
You are all credible messengers and violence disruptors.
These men here and so many more have been there.
We actually service the victim, but we also try to help the perpetrator as much as we can due to the fact that we know it's a mental health issue. You can't teach this in a school. You can have 20 college degrees. You cannot teach going into the community and say, hey bro, hey sis, come on, let's think about what we're doing. Why? Because we've been there and they know that. They know the history of most of us.
like that. I like that. So I just want to go and reference the Wear Orange campaign for 2024 and encourage everyone to scan this QR code, and you can connect to additional resources on this topic. So with that said, I think we're at 7 minutes left. And so I think that's enough time for each panelist to have, a minute and then a little overflow to give us some final words on community media and the intersection of community media and talking about gun violence in our communities. So I think I'm going to start with Shanita and then work our way over this way.
Okay, I would just start with the Wear Orange was cool because I was definitely going to bring that up. June is Gun Violence Awareness Month, and I think of the word intentional. I was very intentional today about wearing orange because that is our color. So when we're intentional of something, there's purpose behind it. So when we're having these type of forums, when we're engaging with communities, when we're talking to young people about what's going on, what they need, be intentional about it. You don't have to do this work to see a young person and say, hello, good afternoon, good morning. Because that speaks to the humanity of this. I don't have to know the worst thing that you've done. I don't have to know all your details to just say hello, because this is a human experience. So as we're reporting, as you're telling stories, be intentional. Just like we talked earlier about both sides, before the tragedy of gun violence, speak to some of the initiatives that are happening in the communities. Speak to some of the good that's happening, because here at RTG, we're a Bronx-based organization, but we're doing a lot of prevention work. We're out in the community. We're having block parties. We're having community grill and chills. We're doing paint and sips. We're popping up in our MTU, which is our mobile therapeutic unit, and we're preaching this word and we're giving out resources because we're intentional. Because before the violence happens, let's get in front of it instead of trying to get behind it. Before another mother has to lose her child, before another family has to go through a loss, let's be intentional about what we're doing, because we're all community. And whether you live in those particular communities or not, we're all affected. So for me, it would always be intentional. Continuing to spread this message, because gun violence is not normal. It has become now the new normal, but it's never normal. And we never want to say, okay, we never want to act like it's just the way things are going. No, we got to be intentional about it. So that is my word. That is my final thought. It is today is the 28th. We have 2 more days. If you have some orange, pull it out. And tell someone, be about it. Do you know orange is that's our color, gun violence awareness. So thank you for having me. Thank you for listening. And I'm so blessed to have been here today. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Anita. Ramik.
Sure. I'd like to just double tap on what Alan was talking about earlier, on how news stories are actually, how folks are interviewed, and identifying that there's a difference between empathy and sympathy. And so when you want to engage individuals, it's important to have empathy, be empathetic with people. Sympathy is something much more layered, and just to be mindful of that. And similarly, when Walter was talking earlier about healing, is that there's a difference between wellness and well-being. And so we need to understand that. And so as I talk with folks who are in this public access community media space, I would just ask that you do what you can do to tell the story fairly. Do what you can do to tell the story comprehensively. Do what you can do to tell the story in a way that sheds light on all of the issues, and not so narrowly in this myopic view of gun violence, gun shootings, gun access, gun proliferation, because it's much more than that. Right? There are policies and practices that are in place across all 50 states that elevate the problems and the challenges around gun violence. There are things that we could do on the local level as community media, working with community-based organizations and institutions within your respective states, cities, neighborhoods, districts, municipalities, all of that, that can really help elevate not only the challenges, but the solutions to gun violence. Because at this point, when you turn on the TV or you read the newspaper, it's very negative. It tells you how bad things are. And that is true. You know, one death for me is one death too many. But there are also some very undertold stories about success, right? There's some very undertold narratives about change that's happening across the nation and different cities, about how different communities of different ethnicities, different backgrounds, socioeconomic, cultural backgrounds are getting together to really solve this challenge of gun violence and violence in general. And I guess that's what I would want to say to you all is, yes, gun violence it's crucial. But if we look at the data and we speak with folks who are hospital violence intervention professionals, you know that gun violence is usually the last event in someone's life. It's usually built up to, again, neglect, poverty, hardship, and then abuse, and then gun violence. And so as folks who can tell a story, elevate a story, produce a story, all of the stuff that you do in terms of community media, really utilize that, your leverage, to tell the fullness of the story and the challenges and the solutions that we face.
Thank you, Rami. Walter?
Thank you. One thought for me is love. If we walk out of here loving each other a little more, violence will end. But you got to tell the story yourself. You got to go back to your house and make sure that you act that way. Make sure that your neighbor understands that you want them to be your neighbor, not the guy you don't want to be with or the gal that you can't stand. Because it all starts in that little moment, that instance when you don't care much for somebody. And then it just takes a negative toll. So let's start with ourselves, right? Let's tell our children, let's come down. There's much better ways to have a discussion. And I'd like to thank Bronx for allowing me to bring the team together who make the videos, who do this, our artists who come up with the stop animation that you saw. Because it's not just me, it's a whole lot of people behind us that work really hard. They film, they edit, they light it, they produce it, and we're able to broadcast it. And all of those lives, I hope, help change someone else's narrative.
Thank you. Alan.
I'm going to steal Shanita's advice and say intentionality. I know community media is in a unique situation where, you're not necessarily, other people are bringing things to you and you're giving people the space, but you're also in an educational capacity at times. And, you do have chances where you can be discerning about, how things are done. And I would say that we can't, a woman I interviewed who's really wonderful, once said she was not working with another journalist and was like, I'm going to talk to you. And I said, can I just ask why? And she said, well, not all attention is good attention. And that has stuck with me. Yeah, there are untold stories out there, but just telling them is not all inherently great. We have to think about, how are we telling them? Why are we telling them? To whom are we telling them? And we can't just be like, oh, we're cranking out more stories. That's the problem with mainstream, is this is how we do it, and we just crank out stories. And whatever's happening, we put it through this meat grinder and it comes out the same sausage that you get every time. We can't do that. We have to think about who are we partnering with? Why? where are people? How can we get to them? We really, really have to be intentional with our storytelling, what stories we tell, how we tell them, and to tell them in ways that are nourishing to people, that are help them understand something more, not just expose them to the horrors of the world or expose them to shootings, but help understand, how do people get to this moment, whether it's gun violence or climate change or whatever you're talking, how do we get to this moment? What's possible now? What does something different look like? Who's already doing that? All of these kinds of things, and being intentional about what you are to the community. I've seen lots of journalism organizations starting to reevaluate what they're even for. Like, maybe you're community conveners, maybe you're not just storytellers. There's all these other things you could do. So I'm going to double down on intentionality and say, like, all of these decisions have to be thought through. You can't just keep doing the same thing over and over again and hoping that eventually it clicks. You have to reflect and think about, like, maybe I could do this differently and get more of an impact. So yeah, that's what I would go with. And I think intentionality is the word.
Thank you, Alan. And so in closing, I just have to say, if, the 4 esteemed panelists that we have here, if their work can grow and flourish, we'll be in a much better world. So thank you for doing the work. And I just want to again thank Elisa Nunn from BRIC's Brooklyn Free Speech, and Audrey Duncan from BronxNet for producing this panel. I'm Ro Johnson, Director of Public Affairs and Social Justice Programming here at BRIC TV. And thank you for attending this panel.